All right. So this deep dive is going to be about protecting whiteness. And I have to admit, even just skimming these articles and research papers,
Yeah.
you know, had me kind of rethinking some things,
Mm.
like some really deep stuff about society. Like you even sent over this 17th century law from Barbados.
Right.
And that's where it really kind of clicked for me, you
No,
know?
yeah, that Barbados law is a really great example because it really illustrates, it shows how this idea of whiteness wasn't something that was always there.
Right.
It was created as a tool, a very specific tool to create
Hmm.
a hierarchy of power, even in a situation where literally everyone was being exploited.
Okay. So unpack that a little bit. When you say constructed,
Yeah.
I mean, people do have different skin colors. I mean,
Yeah,
that's biology, right?
sure. Melanin, skin pigmentation.
Right.
Those are real things, of course.
Right.
But those physical differences don't mean anything about superiority
Right.
or inferiority. It's not inherent. It's the concept of whiteness as separate and superior that was invented to justify colonialism and all of the terrible things that came with it.
So in Barbados, they had both European indentured servants and enslaved Africans,
Yeah,
right?
yes.
Both groups forced into labor. But the law specifically gave more rights to the Europeans just because they were classified as white.
Exactly. And it's important to realize that this wasn't just some random thing on some island.
Right.
Similar laws and ideas, they popped up all across the colonies.
Hmm.
It was a consistent pattern. It was about creating a divide, a system where the people in power could stay in control
Hmm.
by basically pitting groups against each other.
So even poor white Europeans who, weren't plantation owners or anything, they still bought into this idea
Yeah,
that being white gave them some sort of advantage.
absolutely. And one of the sources I sent you called this the psychological wage of whiteness.
Okay.
Even if their own material conditions were bad, they were still treated as a step above Black people, right?
Well,
And so that reinforced this belief that simply being white had a certain social value, even if that value was just not being Black.
wow, that's pretty profound. So it's like they were being paid in like superiority,
Yeah,
even if they were struggling economically.
that's a good way to put it.
That's really interesting.
It's really important to understand, I think,
Yeah.
because it helps explain how this idea that whiteness is valuable continues,
Mm.
even when it doesn't necessarily lead to material wealth or power for every white person.
Okay, so whiteness is constructed as this powerful, even beneficial thing,
Yes.
despite the reality of many white people's lives.
Yeah.
But then these sources show how science got pulled into this,
Right.
which is kind of mind-blowing to me that actual scientists were used to justify this idea of white supremacy.
It's a very dark chapter, a disturbing chapter in the history of science.
Yeah.
One of the sources details Carl Linnaeus,
Right.
the guy who came up with the way we classify plants and animals, right?
Right.
But he also applied his system to humans. And, he put white Europeans at the very top, describing them with the most favorable terms.
Hold on. So the guy who basically gave us the basis for how we understand and organize the natural world is the same guy who helped create this hierarchy of human races. I mean, it's
Really something.
kind of messed up.
It really is. And here's the thing. It wasn't presented as just like his opinion.
Right.
It was taught as scientific fact.
Wow.
And that lent this dangerous legitimacy to the idea that whiteness was pure and superior and in need of being protected.
Which leads perfectly into this whole concept of protecting purity. That I found really disturbing in these sources and how that got tied up with American identity.
Yeah.
It's like this fear that anything that wasn't white would contaminate or weaken the nation.
Right, exactly. And that anxiety about protecting the purity of whiteness really shaped American history and policies. One of the sources was this historical analysis of American textbooks, and it showed how for decades they were basically promoting white supremacist ideas.
Wait, are you serious? Textbooks.
Yeah, no, I'm serious. Not just like subtle bias. It was obvious. They would glorify European colonizers, but downplay or even totally ignore the contributions of non-white people to history and culture.
Wow.
It was just erasure, a deliberate erasure designed to uphold this story of white superiority.
This is making me think about how I learned about American pioneers
Yeah.
settling the West. But we never learned about the indigenous people who were already there.
Exactly. And that kind of selective storytelling has a lasting impact. If you grow up learning a history where your group is the best, the only one that matters, it's going to be really hard to even acknowledge systemic inequality,
Right.
let alone try to challenge it. It's like trying to build a house on a foundation of liars.
Yeah.
And when that foundation starts to crumble, the reaction is often to just like double down, try to protect that crumbling structure instead of building something new and better,
Mm.
you know?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so we've got this foundation built on like a distorted history and this idea that whiteness is something that has to be defended no matter what. But what really hit me in these sources is how this need to protect whiteness
Hmm.
gets inside our heads. Like
Yeah.
it messes with our psychology, you know?
It totally does. And a lot of the sources that you sent really dig into that emotional side of things,
Yeah.
especially the roles of guilt and shame.
Mm.
They argue that those feelings, while totally understandable, can actually make the problem worse.
Okay, I'm listening because that seems kind of counterintuitive, you know?
Hmm.
Like, wouldn't feeling guilty about, say, benefiting from white privilege,
Hmm.
wouldn't that make someone more likely to want to change things?
Yeah, you would think so, right?
Yeah.
But imagine this. Okay, you're a white person, and you're starting to really get how deep racial injustice runs in our history and even now, today.
Yeah.
And you realize that you've benefited from a system that's actually hurt other people, even if you never meant for that to happen.
Right.
I mean, that realization can bring up a lot of guilt.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Hmm.
Like, it's like when you realize you've been wearing your shirt inside out all day,
Exactly.
like awkward and embarrassing.
It is, but it's like that times 1,000.
Right.
Because now it's not just a wardrobe malfunction, it's this realization that you've been part of a system of oppression,
Right.
you know? And for some people, that guilt is so much that it just paralyzes them.
Mhm.
They feel so bad, they just don't do anything. They don't know where to start.
So the guilt blocks them from taking action.
Exactly. And then on top of that, you have shame.
Hmm.
And shame's different from guilt, right? Guilt is, I did something bad, but shame is, I am bad.
Okay.
It attacks who you are.
Right. Shame's like way more personal.
Yeah, way more intense.
Yeah.
And when it comes to race and white privilege, that shame can be really, really hard to face.
Right.
So instead of really looking inward, some people just shut down, get defensive. They might get mad, say racism doesn't exist, or insist that they're not part of the problem.
Hold on. So you're saying that shame is actually at the root of what we call white fragility.
That's exactly what some of these sources say. They say that when white people are confronted with their privilege or with evidence of systemic racism, it can trigger this deep shame.
Right.
And the reaction is to protect themselves, even if it means denying reality or lashing out.
So it's not even about being a bad person or intentionally racist, right? It's like this primal need to protect your own ego,
Exactly.
even if it means upholding a system that hurts everyone in the long run.
Exactly. And that's why just calling people out on their racism or their privilege doesn't always work.
Hmm.
It can actually backfire, and they get more defensive, and they're less likely to actually listen.
So how do we get past that then? If guilt leads to inaction and shame leads to defensiveness, how do we even begin to dismantle this?
It's a big question, right? There's no easy answer. But one thing that really came through in the sources is that this isn't just about individual feelings or morality.
Okay.
Protecting whiteness is woven into the very structure of our institutions, our culture, our whole way of seeing the world.
Even it's like systemic, bigger than just any one person.
Exactly. It's about understanding that even if you aren't consciously trying to uphold white supremacy, you might be unconsciously participating in it.
Oh. Okay, but what does that even look like? Like, what are some examples of how protecting whiteness shows up in our systems, not just, in our attitudes?
Okay, well, think about the criminal justice system. We know that Black and brown people are way more likely to be targeted by police, arrested, and incarcerated, even when they committed the same crimes as white people.
Right.
That's not just a few bad cops, that's systemic.
Right, so it's not just about individual racist cops, it's about the whole structure of law enforcement.
Exactly, and you see the same pattern in education, in healthcare, in housing. I mean, it goes on and on. The sources you sent highlighted all these ways these systems benefit white people at the expense of people of color.
It's almost like we built a house with all these secret passages and trap doors that make it easier for white people to get around while other people are running into walls.
That's a great way to put it. And because these systems are so ingrained, they're easy to miss if you're not looking for them. It's like the air we breathe, you don't even notice it's there until it's polluted.
So if protecting whiteness is this deeply woven into the fabric of our systems, how do we even begin to unravel it all? It's a lot.
It is overwhelming,
Right.
but it's not hopeless. The sources actually offer some good ideas for tackling this.
Okay.
but we'll save that for the final part of our deep dive.
So we've really dug into some heavy stuff in this deep dive, about protecting whiteness.
Yeah.
We started with 17th century Barbados,
Mm.
then modern textbooks, and we even got into like the psychology of guilt and shame.
Right.
My head is spinning. What about you?
It's a lot, but the sources you sent, they do have some hopeful ideas.
Okay.
They don't just point out the problem. They give ways to actually dismantle this system that we've inherited.
Okay, so where do we even begin? Protecting whiteness is so ingrained in everything, our laws, our institutions, our biases.
It's true.
How do we even start to chip away at it?
I think the first step is doing exactly what we're doing.
Mm,
Educating ourselves, talking honestly, challenging what we've always been told.
right.
Knowledge is power, and the more we understand how these systems work, the better we can disrupt them.
Okay, that makes sense. But are there any like practical things people can do? What can our listener do in their own life to make a difference?
Yeah, for sure. One of the sources talked about becoming an active ally. It's not enough to just not be racist ourselves.
Hmm.
We have to actively work to dismantle racist systems.
Okay, but what does that look like?
It can be a lot of things. Supporting groups that are fighting racism, by donating or volunteering, learning more about the history of racism and what people of color experience, speaking up when you hear racist jokes,
Hmm.
even if it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, one of the sources actually talked about supporting policies that promote racial equity,
Yes.
like things like criminal justice reform, affordable housing, access to health care, stuff that doesn't seem directly related to protecting whiteness, but actually gets at the root of the problem.
It's a great point. Dismantling white supremacy isn't just about changing people's minds.
Right.
It's about changing laws and policies, shifting power and resources so that things are more fair for everyone.
It sounds like you're describing a world where this whole idea of needing to protect whiteness just doesn't exist,
Mm.
where people are judged by who they are, not by the color of their skin.
Right, exactly. And in that world, diversity is seen as a good thing,
Right.
not a threat. We can learn from each other,
Mhm.
work together better, create solutions that work for everyone.
It's like we could finally see the full potential of humanity.
That's the idea.
All that creativity and talent that's being wasted because of these systems of oppression.
I know, right? And that's what makes this work so important. It's not just about fixing the past. It's
Mm.
about building a better future for everyone.
So if our listeners take away one thing from this deep dive, what should it be?
I think the main thing to remember is that change is possible. It won't be easy and it won't happen overnight.
Right.
But every step we take, every conversation, every action to dismantle white supremacy, it brings us closer to that world where whiteness doesn't have all the power.
It's about knowing that we all have a role to play, even if it seems small.
Yes.
And even though this topic can be uncomfortable, that means we're on the right track. We're seeing things in a new way.
And that's really what this deep dive has been about, right?
Mm.
Challenging what we think we know, understanding more, and realizing that we can create a more just world.
Thanks for joining us, and keep learning. Keep asking questions. Keep pushing for change. Because a world where we don't have to protect whiteness is a world worth fighting for.